This discussion is going to be on Tiananmen Square, a pro-democracy movement spoiled by authoritarianism and ruined by the myths of anti-communism. The pro-democracy movement, known as the '89 Democracy Movement, is a series of protests that were precipitated by the death of pro-reform Communist General Secretary Hu Yaobang in April of 1989 amid the backdrop of rapid economic development and social change in post-Mao China. They reflected the anxieties among the people and the political elite about the country's future. These protests were not explicitly anti-communist. They were pro-democracy. They included leadership of many members of the Communist Party that supported portions of the protests, as well as student leaders and intellectuals. The protests were not, however, well organized. They were predominantly organized by students and intellectuals, once again. The first series of protests were actually related to the death of Hu Yaobang, and student supporters of Hu Yaobang gathered to support the memory of the member of the Communist Party, and they gathered, generally speaking, publicly at universities and major squares to protest in support of continued reforms. The protest movement then grew from there. By May of 1989, a student-led hunger strike galvanized to support around the country for the demonstrators, and the pro-democracy protests spread to some 400 cities. Ultimately, Deng Xiaoping and other Communist Party member elders believed that the protests could become a political threat and therefore resolved to use force against them. On May 20th, the State Council declared martial law and mobilized as many as 300,000 troops to Beijing. The troops advanced into central parts of Beijing on the city's major thoroughfares in central morning hours of June 4th, killing both demonstrators and some bystanders in the process. However, this military response was actually part of a long trajectory of divided responses within the Communist Party of China. The international portrayal of the protests has been one of universal repression, but this does not reflect the historical reality of the circumstances. The CPC leadership was greatly divided on the responses. Many leaders took conciliatory positions, arguing that greater pro-democracy reforms, such as freedom of the press and so forth, would strengthen the party's position and aid to the path of development toward an eventual communist society. Others took hardline positions. They argued that regional and local offices were responsible for the uprisings because they failed to maintain control over their municipalities and regional centers. They stated that a firm hand from the national government was needed to deal with the protesters, who they portrayed as unruly, riotous, and violent, conjuring up memories of the Cultural Revolution. The international response to the Tiananmen Square incident and protest was almost universally critical of the Communist Party of China and the government of the PRC writ large. However, the responses also fall into two basic groups. First, human rights organizations and UN leadership condemned the government of the PRC. Second, American and anti-communist Cold War allies of NATO argued that communism itself was to blame and imposed arms embargoes on the PRC. In response, then, the PRC expelled foreign journalists. However, ultimately, these protests did not lead to major structural changes. All of this critique ignores that the governments, especially of the United States, had supported very similar repressions to Tiananmen Square in Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, and so forth, in the name of anti-communism throughout the Cold War period. Keep in mind, for example, that the Reagan administration supported genocidal regimes throughout the world in the name of anti-communism, but especially in the case of Guatemala in Latin America. More broadly, the suppression ended the political reforms that begun in 1986 within the PRC itself, and halted the policies of potential reform of the 1980s, which were only partly resumed under Deng Xiaoping's reform platform through the Southern Tour in 1992. The protests notably failed to, however, spark major political reforms across the republic, in contrast to European Eastern Bloc protests during the revolutions of 1989. They were considered, however, a watershed event in the history of the modern PRC, and the reaction to the protests set limits on political expression in China, limits that have lasted up arguably through the present. Remembering the protests is widely associated with questioning the legitimacy of a single-party state, but not necessarily communism itself. This remains one of the most sensitive and most widely censored topics in the PRC. Future President of the United States, Donald Trump, in 1990 commented on the protests. In an interview, he was asked about China's response to student protests, and he labeled the government's response as vicious and horrible on the one hand, but valued it on the other because he saw it as a show of strength. When the students poured into Tiananmen Square, the Chinese government almost blew it, he said in 1990. They were vicious, they were horrible, but they put it down with strength. That shows you the power of strength. Our country right now is perceived as weak, is being spit on by the rest of the world. So this was perhaps indicative of later responses to protests later, but also contrasted somewhat with some other responses from contemporary future presidents of the United States. That being said, Trump was an example of many individuals who were wealthy in the United States who praised the authoritarian response of the PRC government, implying and arguing that they thought that it should be used more frequently around the world. The United States Congress and media criticized the military action writ large, however, especially the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so forth. Then President George H.W. Bush suspended military sales and visits to the PRC. Large-scale protests against the Chinese government also took place around the United States. George Washington University, however, revealed that through high-level secret channels on June 30th of 1989, the U.S. government conveyed to the government of the People's Republic of China that the events around the Tiananmen Square protests were a, quote, internal affair. Essentially, the Bush administration did not want to upset any potential trade relations that had been established during the Nixon administration and onwards. U.S. public opinion of the PRC, however, dropped significantly after the Tiananmen Square protests and the massacre of the students that occurred, from 72% having favorable opinions of the PRC before the Tiananmen protests to only 34% afterwards. In June of 1989, a few days after the government tanks had stormed Tiananmen Square, former President Ronald Reagan, in a speech delivered in London, praised communication technologies for the formidable impact that they would have in eroding the foundations of totalitarian regimes. Reagan said, "Technology will make it increasingly difficult for the state to control the information and its people." Reagan argued the Goliath of totalitarianism would be brought down by the David of the microchip, perhaps ironically because, of course, Reagan had supported totalitarianism in Latin America. Further irony here is not just the support that Reagan had given to surveillance-oriented authoritarianism, but also that the microchip, as it were, has continued to be basically a net neutral impact, leading to both more authoritarianism in many instances and occasionally more democracy in others. Nonetheless, Tiananmen Square continued to haunt American politics in the 1992 election campaign. Then candidate and future President Bill Clinton called out the, quote, butchers of Beijing, and vowed, if elected, to condition his extension of China's MFN status upon human rights reforms. After taking office in May of 1993, President Clinton extended MFN status to the PRC, but also issued an executive order setting conditions on the PRC that would govern this 1994 decision. There ensued an intense, high-stakes debate by the U.S. diplomats to get Beijing and the PRC to accept Clinton's conditions. One of the most well-known images from the Tiananmen Square protests is that image of Tank Man that probably everybody knows. But there was also the Goddess of Democracy, which is surprisingly less well known, but there she is pictured in the center of this slide. When the government of the PRC declared martial law on May 20th and mobilized at least 30 divisions from 5 of the country's 7 military regions, at least 14 of the PLA's 24 Army Corps contributed to the troops. As many as 250,000 to 300,000 troops were eventually sent to the capital, some arriving by air and others by rail. Most of these, of course, were not activated. This was simply a sort of display of force. That being said, tens of thousands of demonstrators surrounded military vehicles, preventing them from either advancing or retreating. Protesters lectured the soldiers and appealed to them to join their cause. They also provided soldiers with food, water, and shelter. Seeing no way forward, the authorities ordered the People's Liberation Army to withdraw on the 24th of May. All government forces then retreated to bases outside of the city. On the evening of June 3rd, state-run televisions warned residents to stay indoors, but crowds of people took to the streets nonetheless, as they had 2 weeks before to block the incoming army. However, this time PLA units advanced on Beijing from every direction. The 38th, 63rd, and 28th Armies from the west, the 15th Airborne Corps, the 20th, 26th, and 54th Armies from the south, and then the 39th and the 1st Armored Division, the Tank Division from the east, and then the 40th and 64th Armies from the north, converging towards the center of Beijing. At 8:30 p.m., Army helicopters appeared above the square, and students called for campuses to send reinforcements. Around 10, the founding ceremony of the Tiananmen Square Democracy University was held as scheduled at the base of the Goddess of Democracy monument. At 10:16 p.m., the loudspeakers controlled by the government warned that troops may take any measures to enforce the martial law. Now, the Goddess of Democracy movement monument may not be well known, but it is in fact based off of Vera Mukhina's worker and Kolka's woman sculpture seen on a Russian stamp here on the right-hand side of the slide, which influenced the creators of the Goddess of Democracy. On June 5th, the suppression of the protest was immortalized outside of the PRC via video footage and photographs of this lone man standing in front of a column of tanks leaving Tiananmen Square via Chang'an Avenue. The Tank Man, as he became to be known, was one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century, but the Goddess of Democracy was almost entirely forgotten. So this leaves us with a question. Why is it that you know Tank Man, but you probably have not heard of the Goddess of Democracy up until this point? Go ahead and make a quick post, and then we'll get the discussion going.